Welcome to Crypto Journal. Hit like right now if you want to understand the real connections between global financial institutions and blockchain infrastructure. Drop a comment telling me which institutional partnerships you want me to investigate next. I read every single one. What if I told you that the International Monetary Fund, the organization that oversees the global monetary system with 191 member countries, just made a historic move that positions blockchain networks like XDC Network at the center of the future global financial architecture? And what if that move happened in March 2025, but almost nobody in the crypto space even noticed? Today, we're exposing how the IMF's recent policy shifts, working papers, and institutional priorities are creating the exact regulatory and economic environment where XDC Network's infrastructure becomes not just useful, but essential. This isn't about the IMF directly investing in XDC. This is about understanding how global financial institutions create the conditions where specific blockchain solutions become inevitable. Let me show you what actually happened. On March 20th, 2025, the IMF released the 7th edition of its Balance of Payments Manual, known as BPM7. For the first time in the IMF's 80-year history, this manual provides detailed guidance to the international statistical community on how to capture digital asset activity in global statistical standards. This isn't symbolic. This is the IMF formally incorporating cryptocurrencies and digital assets into the global economic data systems that 191 countries use to report their financial activity. When the IMF creates official frameworks for reporting blockchain activity, they're not just acknowledging digital assets exist. They're preparing the global financial system to integrate them. But here's what makes this transformational for XDC specifically. The BPM7 classifies digital assets based on their use cases. Tokens used for cross-border payments are classified differently than speculative assets. Stablecoins used for trade finance settlement get different treatment than governance tokens. And blockchain networks providing actual financial infrastructure services are recognized as essential service providers. XDC Network wasn't designed for speculation. It was built specifically for trade finance, cross-border payments, and real-world asset tokenization, the exact use cases the IMF is now creating reporting standards for. This alignment isn't coincidence. This is XDC being positioned at the intersection of institutional need and regulatory clarity. Now let's talk about the trade finance gap, because this is where IMF priorities and XDC capabilities converge perfectly. The IMF and World Bank have extensively documented a $5 trillion global trade finance gap. This isn't theoretical. This is real businesses, especially MSMEs, micro, small, and medium enterprises that can't access letters of credit, invoice financing, or supply chain capital. On October 22nd, 2025, XDC Ventures acquired Contour Network, a trade finance platform originally backed by HSBC, Citi, and Standard Chartered. Contour was shut down in late 2023 because it couldn't scale on traditional infrastructure. XDC is reviving it with blockchain rails and stablecoin integration. This directly addresses the trade finance gap the IMF has identified as a critical barrier to global economic growth. When Ritesh Kakkad, XDC Network's co-founder, announced the Contour acquisition, he stated, "Banks need settlement rails, treasury optimization, and compliance frameworks. We're building all three. This isn't just building technology. This is building infrastructure that solves problems the IMF has explicitly identified in multiple working papers." In 2025, the IMF published Working Paper 2025/185 titled Optimal Policy for Financial Market Tokenization. This paper examines how tokenization of real-world assets can improve liquidity, reduce settlement times, and lower costs in global financial markets. The paper doesn't mention XDC specifically, but it describes exactly what XDC's infrastructure enables. XDC Network processes transactions in under 2 seconds with fees below 1 cent. It supports ISO 20022 messaging, the global financial standard that SWIFT is migrating to with a November 22nd, 2025 deadline. It integrates with our 3-Corda, the enterprise blockchain used by over 300 financial institutions. And it provides hybrid public-private architecture that meets banking privacy requirements while maintaining blockchain transparency. This is the infrastructure the IMF tokenization paper describes as optimal: fast settlement, low costs, regulatory compliance, integration with legacy systems, and real-world utility serving actual institutional needs. Now let's talk about cross-border payments, because this is another area where IMF priorities and XDC capabilities align. The IMF and World Bank released a joint paper in 2023 titled IMF and World Bank Approach to Cross-Border Payments. This paper identifies high-cost remittance corridors, settlement delays, and lack of transparency as major barriers to financial inclusion. According to World Bank data, the average fee for a $200 remittance is 5.7%. In high-cost corridors, fees can reach 7.7%. These costs disproportionately affect developing economies where remittances represent significant portions of GDP. The IMF explicitly calls for technological solutions that reduce these costs while maintaining compliance and security. XDC Network, through partnerships like Bitso Business, is already providing exactly this infrastructure. In May 2025, XDC partnered with Bitso to power cross-border payments from the US to Mexico, one of the world's largest remittance corridors handling over $63 billion annually. Transactions settle in seconds with fees below 1 cent. This is operational infrastructure, solving problems the IMF has identified as critical. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The IMF 2025 Working Paper 2025/186 provides updated guidance on blockchain consensus mechanisms, a primer for supervisors. This paper educates central banks and financial regulators on how different blockchain consensus mechanisms work and which are suitable for institutional use. XDC Network uses XDPUS consensus, a delegated proof of stake mechanism where all validator masternodes are KYC compliant. This is explicitly mentioned in trade finance documentation as an exceptional feature among public blockchains. When the IMF educates regulators on blockchain technology, KYC-compliant validator networks like XDC become the reference standard for institutional-grade infrastructure. Now let's talk about the IMF's position on stablecoins, because this directly impacts XDC's strategic positioning. In September 2023, the IMF and Financial Stability Board released a synthesis paper titled Policies for Crypto Assets. This paper provides comprehensive guidance on how authorities should regulate stablecoins, particularly in emerging markets. The IMF recognizes that stablecoins can reduce cross-border transaction costs, improve financial inclusion, and provide stable stores of value in economies with weak monetary frameworks. But they emphasize the need for full reserve backing, regulatory compliance, and integration with existing financial infrastructure. On September 17, 2025, XDC Network launched USDC and Cross-Chain Transfer Protocol v2. This integration provides one-to-one USD-backed liquidity, enabling real-time settlements for tokenized trade instruments and RWA assets. CCTP v2 enables seamless USDC transfers across 16 blockchains without wrapped tokens. This is exactly the type of stablecoin infrastructure the IMF describes as optimal in their policy papers. Circle, the issuer of USDC, holds reserves managed by BlackRock in compliance with the highest institutional standards. When XDC integrates Circle's USDC, they're not just adding a stablecoin. They're connecting to the institutional-grade reserve management infrastructure that meets IMF policy recommendations. Let me show you another critical connection: ISO 20022 compliance. The IMF explicitly recognizes ISO 20022 as the global standard for financial messaging in multiple working papers and policy documents. SWIFT's November 22, 2025 migration deadline is forcing 11,500 financial institutions to adopt this standard. XDC Network provides an ISO 20022 API solution for financial institutions and corporations worldwide to send and receive financial data for cross-border and domestic payments. The simple API makes migrating to the new financial messaging standard seamless. Institutions can opt to add instant settlement for their digital assets within their financial messaging payload. This is infrastructure that speaks the language the IMF and global banking system are standardizing on. When the IMF talks about modernizing cross-border payments through technology, ISO 20022 compatible blockchain networks like XDC are exactly what they're describing. Now let's talk about how the IMF could potentially collaborate with XDC Network in the future. The IMF doesn't typically invest in or endorse specific blockchain projects, but they do provide technical assistance to member countries on payment system reform, digital currency infrastructure, and financial technology adoption. In their 2023 cross-border payments paper, the IMF states they will identify and target technical assistance to regions where cross-border payment TA is most needed and most valuable. They're specifically focusing on regions underserved by current infrastructure and high-cost remittance corridors. XDC Network operates precisely in these underserved markets. Their partnership with SBI Group targets Asia Pacific. Their counter acquisition targets trade finance in emerging markets. Their integration with Bitso serves Latin American remittance corridors. These are exactly the regions where the IMF is providing technical assistance on payment modernization. Imagine this scenario. An IMF member country in Southeast Asia needs to modernize their trade finance infrastructure. They have MSMEs that can't access letters of credit. They have high remittance costs. They need ISO 20022 compliance. The IMF provides technical assistance on payment system design. And the recommended infrastructure includes blockchain networks like XDC that provide the exact capabilities needed. This isn't speculation about direct partnership. This is understanding how global institutions create the conditions where specific technologies become recommended solutions. The IMF doesn't need to invest in XDC for XDC to benefit from IMF priorities. The IMF just needs to continue pushing member countries toward trade finance digitization, cross-border payment efficiency, and ISO 20022 compliance. XDC is already the infrastructure that solves these problems. When the IMF educates member countries on best practices, XDC-like solutions become the reference architecture. When central banks look for institutional-grade blockchain infrastructure, KYC-compliant validator networks become the standard. When trade finance platforms need blockchain rails, enterprise-grade hybrid architecture becomes essential. Here's another angle. The IMF's work on central bank digital currencies. Multiple IMF working papers discuss CBDC design, implementation challenges, and cross-border interoperability. When central banks issue CBDCs, those digital currencies need to move across borders efficiently, settle instantly, and integrate with existing trade finance infrastructure. XDC's hybrid architecture and interoperability capabilities position it as potential settlement infrastructure for CBDC transactions. The network's integration with R3 means it can connect to the private permission network central banks prefer while maintaining public blockchain transparency for auditability. When the IMF discusses CBDC interoperability in their working papers, they're describing technical challenges that XDC's architecture was specifically designed to solve. This creates natural alignment even without direct collaboration. Let's talk about institutional validation. XDC Network is backed by SBI Group, one of Japan's largest financial services companies. SBI has deep relationships with central banks and multilateral institutions. When SBI invests in XDC and creates the SBI XDC Network APAC joint venture, they're not making speculative bets. They're positioning infrastructure for institutional adoption. XDC is also integrated with frameworks like MLETR, the model law on electronic transferable records developed by the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law. This legal framework enables the digital equivalent of paper-based trade documents like bills of lading. The IMF recognizes MLETR compliance as essential for trade finance digitization. XDC partners with TradeFinix, which appeared in the ICC and Trade Finance Global White Paper alongside World Trade Organization analysis. These aren't random startups. These are organizations recognized by the same multilateral institutions the IMF works with. When XDC's ecosystem partners appear in ICC and WTO publications, when XDCS technology aligns with IMF policy recommendations, when XDCS use cases solve problems IMF working papers identify as critical, the relationship isn't direct partnership. It's strategic alignment. Here's the regulatory timing that makes this particularly powerful. The Genius Act passed in July 2025, creating federal rules for stablecoins. The IMF immediately emphasized stablecoins as essential for modern payments in their policy guidance. XDC launched USDC integration in September 2025. The sequence isn't coincidental. This is coordinated infrastructure positioning. When global regulators provide clarity, when multilateral institutions set standards, when central banks adopt new technologies, the infrastructure that was prepared for that moment captures the opportunity. XDC has been building ISO 20022 compliance, KYC validator networks, and institutional-grade architecture for years. Now the regulatory environment is aligning with what they built. Let me be crystal clear about what we're not saying. We're not saying the IMF is secretly invested in XDC. We're not saying IMF officials are calling XDCS team. We're not promising direct collaboration will be announced. This isn't financial advice. What we are saying, follow the institutional priorities. The IMF has identified trade finance gaps, cross-border payment inefficiencies, and tokenization opportunities as critical challenges. XDC built infrastructure that solves these exact challenges. The IMF creates reporting standards for digital assets. XDC provides institutional-grade blockchain infrastructure. The alignment is strategic, not coincidental. When the IMF's 191 member countries need to digitize trade finance, they'll need blockchain infrastructure that's fast, cheap, compliant, and integrated with legacy systems. When central banks issue CBDCs, they'll need settlement infrastructure that connects public and private networks. When emerging markets need to reduce remittance costs, they'll need ISO 20022 compatible blockchain rails. XDC is positioning itself as that infrastructure, not through marketing campaigns, but through technical alignment with institutional priorities. Not through speculation, but through operational deployment solving real problems. Not through hype, but through strategic partnerships with organizations the IMF recognizes as legitimate institutional actors. The current price of XDC doesn't reflect this strategic positioning yet. With 37.98 billion total supply and consistent transaction fee burns, the market is valuing XDC based on speculation rather than institutional adoption trajectory. But price is always the last thing to catch up. First comes infrastructure. XDC built that. Then comes institutional validation. SBI, Deutsche Telekom, and major banks provide that. Then comes regulatory alignment. ISO 20022, MLTR, and Genius Act create that. Then comes multilateral recognition. IMF working papers and policy guidance establish that. And finally comes adoption, when member countries implement the infrastructure that global institutions have validated. We're somewhere in the final stages of that progression right now. The IMF has formally incorporated digital assets into global reporting standards. They've published working papers on tokenization and blockchain consensus. They've identified trade finance and cross-border payments as priority areas for technical assistance. And XDC has built infrastructure that addresses these exact priorities. Whether the IMF ever mentions XDC by name is irrelevant. When multilateral institutions set standards and member countries implement them, the infrastructure that was designed for those standards captures the adoption. XDC doesn't need IMF endorsement. It just needs to be the infrastructure that solves the problems the IMF has identified. Now you understand what nobody else is discussing. Not because this information is hidden, but because most people don't follow how global financial institutions create the conditions for specific technologies to become essential. They wait for announcements and partnerships. By then, the positioning is complete. If this changed your perspective on how multilateral institutions and blockchain infrastructure align, smash that like button. Drop a comment with your analysis on how the IMF's priorities will shape blockchain adoption in member countries. Tell me which institutional connections you want me to investigate next. I read every comment. Let's see who's actually thinking about strategic alignment instead of waiting for press releases. See you in the next one.